This video is going to focus on the origins of agriculture. So as we look at this idea of producing food, as we begin this unit, the major concepts that are going to be highlighted in this short video are agriculture, and the definition of, vegetative planting, and seed agriculture, two different types of agriculture, and the first agricultural revolution. Not really a war, but we call it a revolution anyways. So when we just look at agriculture, it's something that everyone knows, that everyone has their own sort of definition in their own head. But if we look at the formal definition, it's deliberate modification of the Earth's surface through cultivation of plants and rearing animals to get sustenance for economic gain, excuse me. Basically, it's a systematic way of producing food. And agriculture, oftentimes we maybe think of as farming, but it's a huge economic producing activity. And we'll look at that more in later in the next units, but just to keep that in mind. Agriculture is much more than just getting food, but the primary purpose obviously is to feed this massive population that we discussed in the last unit, that now that the Earth's population has exceeded 7 billion people, we need to know how to feed them. And that becomes the core question of how this has been done for now well over 10,000 years and many years beyond. But the systematic way of agriculture has been around for about 10,000 years. So when we talk about agriculture, the idea of domestication is a core concept in that it is the actual adaptation of living things to suit human needs. That when we domesticate animals, it's taking them and controlling the productive life cycles, whether it's plants or animals, that are more to make it more suitable for humans. So when we look at the different types of agriculture, it varies throughout the world based on the natural landscape or environments. Here you can see a more labor-intensive activity where you're going to see more hands-on production tools. Here we're seeing more capital. Again, this actually starts to reflect a level of economic development, where we see the use of equipment and other animals, or beasts of burden in this case, that have been domesticated to aid in the production of food. So it's often a layered process of this concept, that this domestication not only helps us produce more food, but it helps us in the production of food. We also have different landscapes that we've modified the natural environment. So you can see the terraced landscape here, in an environment where it isn't necessarily suitable for field farming. We've created surfaces that are able to be productive. And then the more wide-scale use of capital or equipment like a combine to do massive industrialized farming that we see today. In the most advanced steps, that we're able to be incredibly productive in today's world, whether we're using modified productive methods like genetically modified seeds, or chemicals to help either protect the harvest or to help them grow into hardier, more efficient crops. So before agriculture, when we look at how humans survived, they were hunting and gathering societies. And this was oftentimes seen with a very negative light, mostly because there was less control in the life cycle for human populations. They're more susceptible to starvation, drought, the natural events or cycles in the environment. But basically, they hunted and fished or gathered plants, berries, other naturally growing foods, and then moved on when those resources were exhausted. And because they were constantly on the move, and because they would basically consume things to exhaustion, these groups were generally 50 people or less. And they, again, migrated with the animals, migrated with the seasons, migrated with, to different areas based on what was available at the time. But it's also seen that life was actually much simpler, that even though there was maybe a daily search for food, oftentimes very little time was actually spent doing that, which meant that the rest of the day, or many hours of the day, were left to their own activities. Whereas if you look at other modern societies, the amount of time we spend today to acquire the things we need for daily life it often exceeds more than a few hours. You're just looking at the natural workday being between 8, 10, 12 hours is a very different lifestyle. But they lived in small groups. It was kind of the key idea, and they were not in one place. They were on the move wherever they went. And there became this huge switch. About 10,000 years ago, this transition really started to happen. And geographers and historians and anthropologists debate what were the exact causes that ultimately led to this change. But generally, they agree that environmental and cultural factors both contributed to this change. That we saw the end of the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, and about 10,000 years ago, where we saw an environmental change, and we started to see a shift in available water resources, and human societies began to search out more stable or sustainable places to survive. And then there's a cultural element, that there started to see practices and belief systems and cultural norms that started to adapt and change, that led to a more sedentary or stable society in one place. Today, however, if we look at hunting-gathering societies, a very, very, very small portion of the world's population is actually still a hunting-gathering society. There are just a few tribes. Generally speaking, they are on the outskirts of modern societies, often trying to avoid or out of contact with most rest of the population. You see some of these groups in parts of the most undeveloped parts of Africa, in South America, in the Amazon. Every once in a while you hear or read about stories of these groups emerging, and the resulting contact or interaction between the modern societies and these hunting-gathering groups. With the invention of agriculture, we started to see this happen around 10,000 years ago in several different places. And we're going to look at this in a second, but on a global region basis. But basically, this was largely influenced by geography. What would flourish in these areas based on geographic factors. So if we look in Latin America and Central America, we see the emergence of squash and beans, potatoes, and corn. Maize is the early ancestor of corn, as being a primary factor that led to higher caloric intake, more heartier diets for the people. When we move to Africa, we see the sort of emergence of yams, and some basic cereal grains, rice and millet. And when we move to Southwest Asia, we see the hearty cereal grains, wheat, beans, barley, oats. Those are some of and rye, key crops that were grown that are still primary cereal crops today. We also see the presence of Mediterranean agriculture. In China, in East Asia, today's China, we saw emergence of rice, and there are actually two different types. There's a wet and dry rice, basically, and the different ways, what conditions it needs to grow. But we see that rice and soybeans, ancestors of the early soybean crops that we grow here in Minnesota pretty extensively, started in East Asia. And then in Southeast Asia, we see a little bit difference. We have what's called more vegetative planting, where there's more of you see the more tropical plants. They aren't seed agriculture, but in fact that they are root-based or more tropical-based, where you see mangoes, taros, coconuts. And we'll look at that more in a video that you'll see that highlights some of the differences in terms of what it did for the actual diets and what that meant for the advancement and development of different societies. So, as we look at that invention of agriculture, we also need to consider where animals, the majority of domesticated animals. Now, given the incredible variety in the animal kingdom, what's amazing is there's only a few actual animals that can be domesticated, and human societies have tried significantly over time to try to domesticate various animals. But really, what you see in this particular map illustrates the core beasts of burden or domesticated animals that are used for food throughout the world. And you'll notice again that the Middle East was actually, or Southwest Asia was sort of a hearth of these domesticated animals. And again, something that you should be aware of. As I mentioned briefly a minute ago, we have two different types of plant cultivation in terms of agriculture, vegetative planting and seed agriculture. really just understanding that the vegetative planting is a reproductive through the basically cloning of existing plants, whereas seed agriculture is through the intentional planting of seeds. And when we look at most of the cereal grain crops, that's what you're looking at with seed agriculture. Together, this process of domesticating animals, domesticating the production of food, is known as the first agricultural revolution. It marks a time in history about 10,000 years ago where human societies changed drastically moving forward. And it allowed for time to develop religion, to develop more populated cities. It created a surplus of food that changed, that allowed people to explore other avenues of life. And to ask the questions that, whether it's in terms of religion or other aspects of education, of science, of learning that we often value significantly today. So hopefully you can summarize or define and explain the concepts of agriculture, vegetative planting, and seed agriculture after watching this video, as well as the components or the things that led into and reflect the first agricultural revolution.